Hey everyone, we have finished talking about the fossil record as a piece of evidence for the theory of evolution by natural selection. And this video is going to talk about geographic distribution of living species and comparative anatomy. So let's start with geographic distribution of living species. Biogeography is the science of actually studying the distribution of life all around the world. So, where certain organisms live throughout the different parts of the world and how they look and how they're similar or different from each other. If you want to study that, you're going to study biogeography. Darwin thought organisms are usually more similar to other species from their same continent. If we think back to the finches, like they had a lot of similarities, even though they were different on the different islands based on the different foods that they ate. They had a lot of similarities to the species that were from the same continent, which was South America. But that different organisms can also share characteristics that may have evolved due to certain environmental pressures. So, if we look at the Mara, which is from South America, and we look at the English rabbit, which is from Europe, we can see that they do have some similar characteristics, and that those similar characteristics may have evolved because they have some of the same environmental pressures. Like maybe they have similar foods that they eat on those different continents of South America and Europe. Maybe they have similar predators that might need them to both have big, long ears to listen for their predators and that sort of thing. But they are a little bit different. And maybe those differences come from the fact that the Mara would have evolved from species that are on the South American continent, whereas the English rabbit would have evolved from species that live on the European continent. And so that can cause them to actually have some differences, even though there are some similar characteristics. Another example that shows this geographic distribution of living species is looking at beavers and capybaras. So the capybara is a kind of beaver-like animal that lives in South America. It lives actually in a similar environment of wetlands, and it looks a lot like beavers, which you might have seen along rivers in the United States. They do have similar body shapes and certain characteristics that are very similar because of the environmental pressures where they are. They are both well adapted to live in wetlands. You can see they have webbed feet that would help them swim, and they just have a certain body shape that allows them to live and do their best in their environment. But there are some differences between them too. Like capybaras don't have a long tail, and beavers do have a long, broad tail. Some of those differences may have come from the fact that the capybaras evolved from species that live in South America, whereas the beaver evolved from species that live in North America. So they do have similarities based on the environment that they live in, but that they have differences because they might have evolved from different organisms that were originally in South America or North America. All right, that's your big idea for geographic distribution of living species and how that can help support the theory of evolution. Let's talk about anatomy. So, when we talk about anatomy, we're talking about a couple different things: homologous structures, vestigial structures, and analogous structures. And those are all three really different definitions, but you'll see and understand through pictures what each of those things is. Let's start with homologous structures. So, homologous structures that are structures in an organism that are inherited from a common ancestor. So, if you look at this picture, you can see the bones in the human body, horse, dolphin, and bat. And what you can see from this picture is that there are some similarities. Like we have a long bone in the upper arm that's called our humerus, and horses also have a long bone in their upper leg, and dolphins have one, and then bats have one too. Those certain structures are similar. You can also see things like our radius and ulna, and how horses might have those structures, dolphins and bats as well. And then our fingers, phalanges, are also present in those other organisms. The reason why we think that we can see similar bone structures between the different organisms is because they are homologous. We think that, hey, humans, horses, dolphins, and bats are all mammals. They're all furry organisms that have give birth to live offspring and feed them through milk. That might have evolved from one common ancestor a long, 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 long time ago, like many millions of years ago. And that the fact that we all may have come from one original mammal has resulted in the fact that we have these homologous structures, or structures that are inherited from a common ancestor. So that's a piece of evidence towards the theory of evolution. Here's just another example of that homologous structure. You can see that even though a bat and a bird both fly, and so their wings are used for a similar purpose, they actually look really different from one another. So bats' wings actually have these structures that are actually kind of similar, more similar to a mammal, like a human or horse, than they are to a bird or something like a chicken. So their structures, even though they're used for the same purpose of flying, their wings are made structurally different. And bat has more in common with other mammals, such as a human, than it does with a bird. That's because of homologous structures. The bat's arm structures are more homologous with other mammal structures. All right, let's talk about what vestigial structures are. Vestigial means it's a structure that has a reduced form or function in a certain organism. We would have a theory that potentially the reason why that structure is even there is because it is from some organism that uh, we evolved from to have that. So, for example, a snake actually has like these kind of bones that look like they could have possibly turned into leg bones. We think that possibly snakes evolved from reptiles who had legs, but that due to their environmental pressures, they didn't need legs as much. So those bones became smaller and smaller and smaller, and they're not useful at all. Snakes obviously can't walk, but they still have those bones in their bodies. Another example of that is the kiwi. The kiwi is a type of bird that has these tiny little wings. Kiwis do not fly at all, but they have tiny wings. And we think that the reason why they have those tiny wings is that they might have evolved from a species of bird that did need to fly. But over millions of years, their wings got smaller and smaller and smaller because they didn't have any advantage to have big wings until they get to how they look like now. The human appendix is also an example of a vestigial structure. Humans do not use their appendix. In fact, sometimes a human appendix can become infected, and you can have your appendix burst or get appendicitis and have to get surgery to have your appendix removed. Some of you may have experienced that. But the reason possibly that humans have this vestigial or useless organ is that possibly we evolved from some species that had to use their appendix for some sort of function in their digestion. We just don't use it. Here's another example of a vestigial structure. If you look at the bone structure of an animal like a whale, you can actually see pelvis bones, which would have been what would cause or grow to be your legs. But they're very, very small in whales compared to the rest of their body. And whales obviously don't stand or use legs. But we think possibly that whales may have evolved back into the ocean. Like mammals came up on land and we're living on land, and that whales maybe evolved down from those mammals living on land to go back in the ocean. And when they went back in the ocean, they didn't really need legs. So instead, they grew flippers and their legs became much smaller, but they still have leg bones like pelvis. And so those are vestigial because they're useless, they don't have any purpose. All right, last but not least, let's talk about analogous structures. You may have heard in English class of an analogy when you're relating one thing to another thing. That's where this word comes from, analogous structures, kind of like an analogy. Now, analogous structures, they're used for the same purpose, but they look really different. When you look at how they're actually constructed and made, they might be made of different materials. The bones might be formed in a different way, but those organs or structures in the body are actually used for the same purpose. So sharks have fins that help them swim. Penguins are a type of bird who has feathers or fins that they're actually wings that actually help them swim in the water. And then dolphins have flippers, which allow them to swim in the water. So sharks have fins, birds like penguins have wings, and dolphins have flippers. And those are all three structures that actually kind of look the same on the outside. And they all have the same purpose of helping with swimming. But on the inside, they're constructed differently. The bones in the flipper look really different from the bones in a bird's wing or in a shark's fin. So they're most likely not inherited from a common ancestor, which makes sense because mammals are in a different phylum than birds are and then fish are because, well, they're actually in the same phylum of Chordata, but they're in different orders. And so because they are in different groups, different clades, they actually have different bone structures. They probably didn't evolve from a common ancestor, whereas dolphins and whales actually have more similar flipper bones and may have evolved from a common ancestor. But dolphins, penguins, and sharks, all three have structures that help them swim, and they actually look pretty similar, but they're constructed differently or made of different materials. That's an analogous structure. Here's another example of analogous structure. Bats have wings, birds have wings, and insects have wings. Those wings help those organisms to fly, but you can see that the bone structure is very different. And in fact, in insects don't even have bones. Those are just wings that are not made of bones, and they're probably made of something more material like chitin. But bat wings are made of bones and bird wings are made of bones, but they're made of different materials and they're shaped differently, but they do have the same common purpose. Because they have the same purpose, even though they look different, structurally, they are analogous structures. All right, that covers both geographic distribution of species and comparative anatomy as some evidence for the theory of evolution.